That's good. All right. Again, sorry. Late. Took a little longer moving in bed than we anticipated, but that's okay. We're going to be in Numbers 11 tonight. So you'll remember last time we saw them leave Sinai. And so this is the beginning of their trip. And you'll remember that we saw maybe some slight indications that they weren't fully obeyed in chapter 10. The order in which they left the camp was slightly different, and then the placement of the ark was slightly different. Nothing was said about it, but it's what wasn't said that kind of indicated maybe this was the beginnings of their slide into autonomy, doing things their own way. Because remember, up to this point, several times we were told, they did everything exactly the way the Lord told them to. And this time, we're not told anything. It's told to us how they're doing it, and if you remember back, you remember, wait a second, that's not exactly what they were told to do. But whether or not you see that sort of as the beginnings or not, in this chapter, we're certainly going to see them begin to distrust and disobey the Lord who has brought them up out of Egypt. And so we're going to explore that a little bit tonight. So let me pray for us, and we will dive right in. Father, we thank you for your mercy and your grace to us in Christ. We thank you for this opportunity to study your word. And we do pray that your Spirit would be with us, opening our minds and our hearts to receive your word, to understand it, and to bring forth its fruit in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so again, Numbers chapter 11. And there's some debate as to how the first 3 verses relate to the rest of the chapter. So look there with me. All right, so Numbers chapter 11, beginning at verse 1, we're told right off the start, and the people complained. All right, and so you remember at the end of the last chapter, Moses was speaking to his brother-in-law, saying, hey, come, the Lord has promised good to us, and he'll do good to us, and we'll do good to you. But immediately, we're told at the beginning of chapter 11, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, about the evil that they were having to go through. The ESV never quite knows exactly how to translate the language of evil, because in Hebrew, evil sometimes refers to moral evil, where people do wrong things, where they transgress God's law and do evil to one another. That's the way we normally think. We're going to always hear evil with moral overtones. But Hebrew uses the same word for what we might call misfortunes, or just things going wrongly. And there's some sense to that when you remember that they believe in a sovereign God. The problem is that when it's God who's bringing the misfortunes, we're like, okay, that's not evil. And so that's why the ESV sometimes translating, they try to figure out how to translate the text. But basically, the people think their circumstances are evil. They think that God is not treating them right. He's not doing right by them. That is the complaint. And we're told that they complained in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled against them, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outer lying parts of the camp. And so they're complaining that God's not treating them right. The Lord's anger is kindled by their complaints. And then the Lord causes fire to burn along the outside of the camp. And notice then how the people reply or respond to this. We're told in verse 2, then the people cried out to Moses as Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So when the people complained against the Lord, and then they cry out to Moses to put an end to it. And so they complain that God's not treating them right, and they cry out to Moses when God begins to punish them. And of course, because of all this, the name of that place is going to be called Taberah, which means burning, because that's where the fire of the Lord burned against them. And often, when you read a Hebrew narrative like this, you kind of expect the first few verses to be sort of an overview of the whole scene. The problem with that here is that this actually seems to be a separate incident, all right? Because the rest of the chapter is going to describe in much more detail the people complaining against the Lord and the Lord's wrath being kindled against them. But some of the details are slightly different. So, for example, we're told at the end of chapter 11 that it's a plague that breaks out, not fire. Now, again, we think of plague, we think of disease, but remember, the plagues that broke out against Egypt were not all diseases. So it's possible that fire could be a plague. But there's also the trouble that the place is given a different name. So if you look at verse 3, this place is called burning, Taberah. But if you look at the end of the chapter, Hebroth Hatabah, or I'm not very good at pronouncing those words, but something like that, which is, means the grave of craving, where craving led to death, basically, is the meaning of that. And so, because we have a different name, because we have a slightly different punishment, it seems that these are separate incidents. And so, what Moses is trying to do, I think, is drive home the point that, hey, we're going to kind of zoom in on one incident of what happened, but it's probably not the only time that this happened. And in fact, in subsequent chapters, the Lord is going to say, they have rebelled against me these 10 times. And we haven't actually read 10 accounts since they left Sinai of them rebelling. So you kind of get this idea that rather than giving us sort of a summary of the same incident at the beginning and then describing it in greater detail, he gives us a snapshot of one, then he zooms in on another to kind of drive home the point that, hey, this was becoming the regular pattern of the people. That doesn't surprise us because we saw these same people when they left Egypt, right? I mean, this is them, immediately after they left Sinai. So it's more than a year since they left Egypt. But remember, they weren't out of Egypt very long before they started complaining there too. In fact, with some of the similarities that you see going on here, it seems fairly clear that the point that Moses is driving home here is they haven't yet learned their lesson, and they don't seem likely to learn it anytime soon. Which of course is going to be confirmed when we get to the edge of the promised land and they refuse to go in. These people are obviously going to end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But we have this initial scene here where the people complain in the hearing of the Lord. They complain that God promised good to us, but He's not doing good to us. He's not treating us right. He's not treating us the way we deserve. And so they complain to Moses, and Moses prays, and the fire dies down. But immediately, they again begin doing the same thing in verse 4. And really, it's that longer scene, beginning in verse 4, that I want us to focus on tonight. And so pick up with me there in verse 4. It says, "Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving." All right, so again, there's a little bit of debate here. What does it mean by the rabble? If I remember correctly, this is the only place that word is used. So it's not immediately clear. Some think that the rabble here refers to sort of the non-Jews that are among them, right? So remember, when they came out of Egypt, some people who were not physically descendants of Abraham nevertheless attached themselves to the people who were on their way out of slavery. There were other people enslaved in Egypt, and they're like, hey, if you're getting out, we're going with you. And so there are some who think that rabble here refers to the foreigners who have attached themselves, and they think that because of the next line there, all right? It says, "Now the rabble that was among them," so that, the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept. And so some commentators think they're sort of drawing this distinction between rabble and the children of Israel. I'm not fully persuaded that's what's going on here. There's nowhere else where the foreigners among them are sort of thrown over the bus like that. And so there's no way to know for sure, but if you don't know for sure, it's probably best not to identify the rabble with a sort of ethnic group. It's probably best to identify them with exactly what we would think of when we think of the rabble. Just sort of the complainers, the ones who are of poor character. That's the way we kind of normally think of that language. And that could be ethnic Israelites, or that could be foreigners among them. I don't think their heritage has much to do with their character at this point. But there's a group amongst them, again, whatever their heritage, there's a group amongst them that are sort of poor character, and they are complaining against the Lord because they have a strong craving. And I think what we're meant to see, the transition from rabble in the first part of verse 4 to the people of Israel in the second part of verse 4, what we're supposed to see is what the proverb says: bad company corrupts good morals, right? Their complaining spirit spreads, right? So there's a rabble amongst them. There's a rabble who is distrusting God. There's a rabble who is complaining, and that rabble spirit, that discontent spirit, that spirit that thinks God is holding out on them, not treating them right, that spreads to the whole group. So that before long, the whole group of Israel, again, that doesn't mean every single individual, but collectively speaking, sort of the spirit of the nation turns to one of complaining against God. Notice specifically what they're complaining about, right? We're told they have a strong craving. What is it that they want? They want meat. All right? What have they been eating up to this point? All right, actually, let me ask you a question. Where are they? Let's just remind ourselves. Where are they? They're in the wilderness, right? And so what have they been eating in the wilderness? Well, these are not trick questions. You guys know these answers by heart, right? What have they been eating in the wilderness? Manna, right? So they've been eating, the bread of heaven. They've been reading the supernaturally provided bread, which is actually described for us beginning in verse 7. It says, "Now the manna was like coriander seed." I have no idea what coriander seed is, and I didn't have time to look it up. So, but its appearance was like a word that starts with two consonants, padella. Right? So, again, no idea. Maybe some of you know what that is. What is coriander seed? What is padella? I don't have the slightest idea.
It's the seed of cilantro.
It's the seed of cilantro. All right. Well, that's better than I do. All right. So, and so the people would go about and gather it up, and they'd grind it, or beat it, or boil it, and they'd make cakes of it. And its taste doesn't sound bad, when they made it. The taste of cakes baked with oil, right? That doesn't sound bad, but it probably gets a little monotonous after a while. Elsewhere, we're told it had a taste of honey to it, so there was a little bit of a sweetness to it. Who was I talking to? I think it was Danielle Satchow. She made cornbread for us, and I was like, "I'm very glad you put sugar in your cornbread." And she's like, "Yes, I don't do the southern thing." So I guess one of the only places in the world where the Yankee recipe is more sweet than the southern recipe. And I am very thankful for Yankee cornbread, all right, because it has sweetness to it, and I like that. All right, and so we're told that the manna had a little bit of sweetness to it, and what we're told in verse 9 is when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. We're clearly supposed to see this as supernatural provision. Right? This is not a natural phenomenon. Again, you could find commentaries on members, that have a certain critical spirit to them, sort of an anti-supernatural bent, and they're all trying to, explain what this food was as if it was something natural. You are completely missing the point if you try to find some natural explanation for manna. There isn't one. All right? This is supernatural provision. And nevertheless, despite this supernatural provision, the people have a craving. They want meat. They're tired of the bread. And so again, the point I think that we're supposed to see is that they are almost entirely focused on what they don't have rather than what they do. What God has withheld from them rather than what God has supernaturally provided. What does that sound? What does that remind you of? Remind you of the stories in the Old Testament? Maybe some originating stories, right? Like what happened in the garden? All right? In the garden, God has provided for them abundantly. And what do they focus on? What He has withheld. That is the blueprint of sin. That is the blueprint of rebellion against God, is that you distrust Him. You think He's holding out on you. You think that what He has provided is less than the best, less than good, that He somehow has evil intentions for you. And it is that mindset, that distrust of God, that thinking that we need something other than God's providence, that leads people into rebellion, that leads people into all manner of sin. And when you see it that way, I think you can immediately begin to see that these people are not that different from us. Right? That same spirit resides in all those who have descended from Adam. That same ability to focus on what God has withheld is in all of us. I know, as a kid, I used to read these stories and be like, how in the world, can these people be so stupid? How in the world can they be so stiff-necked? How in the world? And I think the older I get, the more I realize, no, these people are a lot like me. I can so easily focus on what I don't have. If you could step back and look at my life objectively, like, oh man, God has taken care of, God has blessed, God has poured out His goodness, on this rebel, on this stiff-necked rebel, over and over and over again. And yet, what he tends to fixate on, what leads him into self-pity, is craving. The desire for something that God has not provided. And sometimes it's a good thing. The desire for me is not a bad thing, right, in and of itself. But it's that desire, that demand, that craving for what God has not provided in the moment. And again, the contrast, we see sort of the similarities back to the first Adam, but the contrast with the second Adam is overwhelming, is it not? Because Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness, right? And at the end of that, we're told, and one of the grand understatements of the Gospels, He was hungry. He spends 40 days in the wilderness and He was hungry. And Satan comes to Him, tempts Him, and says, if you are truly the Son of Man, turn these stones into bread. Feed yourself. All right? And of course, we know Jesus' response is, no, man does not live by bread alone, but he, according to the language of 1 Peter, he entrusted himself to the Father. He entrusted himself to the Father. He rested in God's provision. Rather than making demands, rather than asking, well, if I'm the Son of God, why are you treating me this way? He entrusted himself to the Father, recognizing man does not live by bread alone, but I live by the Word of God. Your words are life. And again, so we see that contrast. But not only are they focusing on what they don't have, notice what comes next. Right, so they're in here focusing on what they don't have, and they are also nostalgic for Egypt. All right, I mean it's hard to believe, but look what they say beginning in verse 5. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. How many of you think that's an accurate description of their time in Egypt? Like, what were they in Egypt again? Slaves. And not just slaves, but slaves who were harshly treated, not well treated servants, but harshly treated slaves. Slaves, whom the authorities wanted to wipe out as a people. All right, and their treatment only got harsher as time went on. And so they have this nostalgia for a golden age that never existed. All right, and again, that is so like us, is it not? When we are focused on what we don't have, we think, oh, we were better off before we started following Jesus. We were better off before we knew God, before God made us his slaves. We were better off when we could do our own thing. We were better off when we were on our own. And again, that is just the standard language of temptation. All right? And in fact, I think it's interesting because Paul uses very similar language in Romans chapter 6. In Romans chapter 6, Paul says, when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. All right? So before you knew Jesus, before you came to faith, before you bowed to the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, you had a kind of freedom. All right? That's actually true. Paul's acknowledging that. He says you had a kind of freedom. You were not a slave to Christ. You were not having to follow him. God's word was not your mandate. You could do what was right in your own eyes. And there's a kind of freedom. And sin sees that freedom as something beautiful and good, as unlimited fish and cucumbers and leeks and garlic in Egypt. Right? That's how sin sees the freedom of not being under Jesus' yoke. All right, but what does Paul say? Paul says, but remember the reality. Remember the reality. What was the reality? He says, what you were free in regard to righteousness, but what fruit were you getting from that freedom? Where was that freedom taking you? And Paul says it as clearly as he can say in Romans chapter 6. He says that freedom was leading you to death. It was killing you. Right? And I think Paul's words in Romans 6 give us a blueprint for how we ought to fight against this type of sinful nostalgia of sin. The idea that we'd be better off if we didn't have to obey God. If I could just do my own thing, if I could just do what was right in my own eyes, if I just didn't have to follow him, then I'd be better off. That's the lie. And Paul says, no, remember the truth. Don't fall for the nostalgia. Don't see things through the lenses of sin. See things as they really are. See that those things of which you are now ashamed, he says, those things were leading you only to death. That's what the Israelites can't see. Right? The Israelites have on the lenses of sin. They're seeing the world through that distorted perspective. And so they remember Egypt as someplace good. And just let the dissonance of that, let the idiocy of that, be for you a picture of the foolishness of sin. This is what sin makes you sound like. Like if you're sitting there thinking, how did they be so dumb? That's actually good, Keep that thought in your mind and then say, how can I follow in their footsteps? By thinking of freedom from God in the same way they think of Egypt. If I could just be free of his law, if I could just be free of his will, if I could just do my own thing, then I would have unlimited fish in Egypt. Well, that's not true, because what you really have in Egypt is unlimited hours of making bricks without straw. It leads you to death. And don't believe the lies. And so we have this picture of them complaining, of what they're remembering, of what they're complaining about. And we're told that they, that Moses hears all this. Verse 10. It says, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his own tent. And again, you wonder why that little line's thrown in there. Commentators suggest, just sort of to expose the ridiculousness of this. These slaves now are all in their own tents. They've been made a people, and yet they've achieved the Israelite dream, of a tent, and yet all they can see is what they don't have. It's just an interesting contrast. He says that Moses could hear the people weeping, everyone at the door of his own tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and and Moses was displeased. All right, so that's scene one. All right, the people complaining because they have a craving. And there's so much we can learn from them. We could obviously pause there and explore those things deeply, but we want to get through the whole narrative, so we have to kind of push on to the next scene. And the transition to the next scene is that statement that Moses was displeased. Because now the focus is going to shift from the people complaining to Moses complaining. All right, we're not used to seeing Moses in a negative light. That actually happens a couple times in the book of Numbers, and so we need to make sense of what's going on here with Moses. So beginning at verse 11, we're told Moses said to the Lord, "What? Why have you dealt ill with your servant?" It's that same. Why are you doing evil? The people complained about their misfortunes. God, they're evil. Moses is complaining about his evil, that the Lord is dealing ill with him, and that he is not treating him right. In fact, he makes this explicit as he goes. He says, "Why have I not found favor in your sight?" What's the implication of that question, right? Why have I not found favor in your sight? Obviously, I should have. Obviously, I deserve better from you. I've been a faithful servant. Why have I not found favor in your sight? So not only is he assuming that God is not showing him favor, not working good for him, he's also assuming that he deserves whatever good God would work for him. Again, this is the logic of sin. That what God's given us is not good enough and that we deserve better. Right? The logic of faith obviously is entirely different. The logic of faith begins with the assumption that we are justly deserving of what? Justly deserving of his wrath. And without hope except in his sovereign mercy. Right? The logic of unbelief, the logic of sin is turned exactly on its head. That what we are deserving of is better than God has given us. Right? And we see that coming from Moses here. As he cries out, why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And again, question. When did God say that to Moses? When did God tell Moses that he was responsible, for getting these people into the promised land, right? Moses is seeing, that God is laying on him this impossible burden that God has never asked him to carry. And so again, he's complaining against God's justice, he's complaining against God's righteousness, complaining that he is asking too much of him, that he's demanding that he do the impossible. All right, and so Moses again is seeing himself, again through the lenses of sin, the same lenses of unbelief that the people were complaining. And so his complaint, they have the strong craving for meat, and his complaint is, where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? Where is that even possible? And when I read that question this afternoon, it reminded me of something that the disciples once asked Jesus, right? When Jesus is there feeding, teaching the 5,000, and he says to the disciples, have them sit down and give them something to eat. And the disciples are like, where are we supposed to get food for all these people? And it's that same kind of question. Where, how is that supposed to happen to God? Well, don't we, serve the God who's been feeding this people for a year in the wilderness? Maybe he might be able to do something here. But that's not what Moses does. Again, Moses focuses inward. He focuses on himself. It's an expression of self-pity. How could you ask this of me? How am I supposed to be able to do anything about this? And of course, then that leads us to sort of his ultimate expression of self-pity, where he says, verse 15, if you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I might not see my wretchedness. He said, if this is what it's like to follow you, I'd be better off just being dead. I'd be better off dead than serving you. Is basically what Moses is saying at this point. And of course, we've heard others, or if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know others who have said similar things at different points in their service of the Lord. But I want you to see that it is the ultimate expression of self-care. I'd be better off dead than serving you. This is the opposite of the psalmist who says, to be a servant, in the house of the Lord is better than to be a prince elsewhere. And he says, no, I'd be better off in the grave than serving you, than being at the head of your people. And so again, I think the point that we're supposed to see here is that Moses' posture towards the Lord at this point is not fundamentally different than that of the people who are craving meat. He has the same complaining spirit. He has the same self-pity. He has the same focus on what he doesn't have and what's being asked of him, being demanded of him. But as the story unfolds, we're going to see that God is going to reply both to Moses and to the people, and that their responses to God's response will diverge. All right? And so, we kind of see ourselves in Moses and the people in their initial grumbling against the Lord, right? We can see ourselves in that. But as the story unfolds, God's going to reply to both of them in parallel ways. All right? But their responses to God's response are going to go in different directions, and ultimately that's what's going to make the difference. Because we're going to get a picture here of the difference between Moses' response and the people's response to God's response to their complaint. So let's look at this then, because we see God's response to Moses first. All right. So God's response to Moses first, beginning in verse 16. All right. So it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you." All right, so you'll remember that these elders, these leaders, they had been appointed earlier. Okay, you remember that part of the story, right? When they come out of Egypt, Moses is kind of like the only leader, and they kind of have to get organized very early on. In fact, it was Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, who kind of recommended, hey, you know what? You can't bear all this alone. You need to set up some division of labor here, where there's going to be commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, commanders of 50s, and there'll be different levels of leaders. So this is not the establishment of the leadership. In fact, it's using that establishment. He says, bring to me people whom you know to be elders. All right, so bring 70 men whom you know to be leaders in the community. All right? And so what's going to happen to these elders? Well, verse 17. He says, "I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone." All right? So what does God say he's going to do? He says, "I'm going to take some of the spirit that is on you and give it to them." What's sort of your gut level response to that language? I'm going to take some of the spirit from you.
Being demoted.
Say again?
It's being demoted.
Being demoted? All right, yeah. It sounds a little bit like judgment language, doesn't it? Again, I don't think that's the way we normally read this story. We're so prone to not see Moses in the wrong, except when we get to chapter 20. Like that's the one place where Moses can be wrong, is when he strikes the rock. But everywhere else, we kind of tend to read him as in the right. That's not the way this story reads. All right, we've seen Moses complaining, this sort of the same spirit as the people, and now the language of taking the spirit from you. Now, it doesn't say he's going to take all the spirit from you. It doesn't say that. But he also doesn't just simply say, "I'm going to the same spirit I've given to you, I'm going to give to them." That's not what he says. He says, "I'm going to take some of the spirit from you, and I'm going to give it to them." So there's a sense that, yeah, I'm going to give you what you want, but there's at least the hint that God giving him what he wants is in some sense a judgment. It's going to help you out. But in the very next chapter, we're going to see people questioning Moses' authority because he's not the only prophet on this. He's not the only one the Lord speaks through. All right? And so this is actually going to lead to some trouble for Moses in the near future. And so, but that language also has, I think, a second significance. Not only is there just sort of a hint of judgment in it, it is also a proclamation that what God has provided up to this point has not been deficient. All right? What do the people need? What does Moses need? They don't need more spirit. The spirit that's been given is sufficient. And so God says, listen, I'm not going to give more spirit. I'm going to take what I've given to you and I'm going to divide it up amongst the elders. Because what I've already given is enough. What I've already provided is sufficient. And God is sort of hinting at, declaring the sufficiency of what He has provided to His people. I've not under-provided for you. It's not like, oh, you've drawn my attention to a need, and now I'm going to give you the extra that you always needed all along. He says, I'm not providing anything extra. But I'm going to take what I've given to you, and I'm going to divide it up amongst the people. All right? Yeah, question? Yes.
So this seems like what Moses did in the first 3 verses was that Moses actually interceded on the people's behalf. In this case, he's almost given up that role.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the solidification of that judgment, is that role as chief mediator is now divided amongst the leaders. Yeah.
And it's interesting. It seems to be, the language is that this is sort of a temporary thing, because it's like they don't continue to do so. But you're right. I mean, this is God's response to Moses' at least temporary self-pity application. I think you're exactly right. I think that's what's going on here. I think we are meant to see Moses in the wrong here. And that God's response, like his response to the people, God is giving him what he's asked for, but it's almost as a judgment. I'm going to give you quail he's going to say just a little bit, and you're going to eat your full. Here, I'm going to I'll spread out the spirit. I'll give it to other people so that you're not alone in leadership. All right. And again, both of those are good things. God's long-term plan for His people is that they will feast in the house of Zion. Right? Manna was never the forever plan for the people. God never intended them to live on this bread, as their only diet forever. This was their provision in the wilderness as He was taking them to the promised land. And it's the same with the leadership of Moses. It was never the intention that Moses alone would be clothed with power for this work of ministry. I mean, in fact, this is in some ways what goes on here. In some ways, echoes the language of Pentecost, right? Others are going to be clothed with power. Pentecost is everyone, but that's actually what Moses says. Wouldn't it be great if everyone was a prophet? And wouldn't it be great if everyone was clothed with power? And so what you see is that kind of what they're after is not in itself a bad thing. The bad thing is that they are demanding it on their timetable rather than the Lord's. Right? They are not entrusting themselves to the Lord. They're not like Jesus in the wilderness who says, I will live by the word of my Father. He'll provide for me when He provides for me. I'm not going to deviate from His plan. I'm not going to take matters into my own hands. The Holy Spirit who brought me into the wilderness, and I will be here till He tends to me. Which, of course, is what we see happen at the end of the temptations, right? The angels of the Lord come and care for him after he has withstood the temptation. God's plan for Jesus was never that he would spend the rest of his life in the wilderness starving, right? But there was a road to travel, and it's the same for us. One of my thoughts as I was working on this is that there's actually something of an over-realized eschatology here. And what I mean by that is that there's a vision of what God is ultimately going to give to His people, but the problem is that they're demanding it now. God, we're not willing to wait. We're not willing to wait on you. I heard a pastor, and again, I have no idea who it was. It was on Moody Radio. So I was driving, and you hear like 3 minutes of a sermon. You've never had that experience. So I don't know who it was, but it was really good. So he was preaching, and he was actually talking about the difference between faith and what he called word of faith. He said if a word of faith preacher got a hold of this text, I don't even know what the text was because I only heard 3 minutes of the sermon. He said if a word of faith preacher got a hold of this text, he would tell you to just claim your health. Claim your health now, because that's God's long-term plan for you. And if you just claim it, God will give it to you, as if you can sort of demand God's final good on your own timetable. And he said that is not the way it works. God has a plan for his people that is beyond our imagination good. But in the present reality, we are pilgrims and sojourners in the wilderness. And he sometimes asks us to go without, so that we might learn obedience through what we suffer. And again, I have no idea what the text was. Maybe it was the Hebrews text. I don't know what text he was preaching on, but that just resonated with me, because I know not to be a prosperity gospel person, right? I know that. You guys know that. We know we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to believe that. We're not supposed to be word of faith. And we so resist learning obedience through suffering. We so resist learning to trust God in the wilderness, because it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And yet that's what God is doing for his people here. He is teaching them obedience through what they are suffering. He says, listen, trust me. Entrust yourself to me, and I will lead you into the promised land. But that's exactly, again, what the people are not willing to do. And again, this is the seeds of why they don't go in. They don't trust God here, and when they get to the promised land, they won't trust him to take them in. And by not trusting God, sort of demanding it on their own agenda, they end up actually cutting themselves off from what God has for them. That is the irony of sin. Sin is always grasping for something that's been deemed good, often something that is actually good, and yet it's grasping it for it in a way that cuts us off from the very thing we're seeking. Right? We see this with something like pornography, right? One of the best books that evangelicals use on pornography is called False Intimacy, right? Because what are they after? They're after something that God created for good, right? But they're going for it in a way that will actually cut them off from the good that their heart actually craves. And again, that's what we see going on here. But again, Moses, let's see. So God has sort of answered Moses and said, I'm going to put my spirit on them. So that's God's reply to Moses. But then we pick up God's reply to the people, right? And again, the way the stories are woven together, these just sort of follow on each other. They're right in the same paragraph. But it's helpful to kind of keep in your mind what's going on. So you've got God saying in verses 16 and 17, here's my reply to you, Moses. I'm going to take some of the spirit from you and give it to them. And then, in beginning in verse 18, you have, and say to the people. Here's my reply to them. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. All right? So God is saying, listen, I'm going to give you what you deserve. But just like with Moses, there's a hint of, actually maybe even more than a hint here, it's a little more obvious here. There's a hint of judgment, because notice what he says. You shall not eat just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month. Now, if you're a glutton like me, that might sound good. A whole month of feasting, right? All right, but then notice what he says. He says, until it comes out at your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. He says, I'll give you what you're asking for. I'll give it to you in superabundance, but it will not be the satisfaction that you think. It'll actually be loathsome to you. Again, it's so typical of our experience in this fallen world. That the things that we so crave, God sometimes judges us, disciplines us by giving us the thing we've been asking for, by giving us the thing that we want, so we can realize this is not where satisfaction is found. You think life consists in having meat to eat. It does not. You think life consists in abundance of possessions. It does not. You think life consists in sensual pleasures. It does not. You think life consists in the praise of men. It does not. He will often give us the very thing our heart craves as a judgment. He will hand us over and say, have it. This is what you think. This is what you set your heart on. Have it. And see where it leads you. It reminds me of that song that we sing sometimes, Satisfaction, where the things that we crave become dust in our mouth. We think they're going to provide us with satisfaction, but ultimately they do not. So God says, I'm going to give you in abundance what you've been asking for, but it will become loathsome to you. Because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? All right? So again, this is God's response to the people. But of course, Moses still doesn't quite get it. He's like, how's that going to happen? Again, you wonder, is this more like Zechariah's how, or is this more like Mary's how? It seems to be more in the Zechariah how range, like doubting, not like, man, that's going to be amazing, God. I can't wait to see how you're going to do it. It's like, God, how many are you going to pull that off? All right? And so verse 21, but Moses said, the people among whom I am number 600,000 on foot, and you have said, I will give them meat, that they may eat a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, and be enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, and be enough for them? And the Lord said, is the Lord's hand shortened? Really? Do you not know who I am? I am the Lord God who brought you up out of Egypt. I am the maker of heaven and earth. Just wait and see. You will see that my word, he said, whether my word will come true or not. And of course, that's a rhetorical question. He's saying, listen, just watch. Is basically what God is saying to him at this point. He said, just watch what I'm going to do. And so, we again see how God replies to their complaints. He basically says, I'm going to give you what you asked for, but it's not going to be what you thought. All right? And so that's where we pick up here, because that's exactly what the Lord does. And so beginning in verse 24, he says, so Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord, and he gathered 70 men of the elders of the people and placed them around the tent. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the Spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. And as soon as the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but they did not continue doing it. And so God does exactly what he said he was going to do. He takes some of the Spirit, he puts them on here. Now we're told explicitly that this was a temporary thing, that they prophesied temporarily. Whether we're supposed to mean it's just the prophecy of this temporary, or just the empowering, the clothing of the Spirit with power for this ministry was temporary, it's not exactly clear. These 70 elders aren't going to play a huge role, as far as I remember, in the rest of the story. But nevertheless, God does this. They prophesied, and to show again that this was sort of God's sovereign provision. We have this interesting thing that happens in the next paragraph, because two of the guys who were called to the tent meeting didn't show up. Okay, we're not told why they didn't show up, but the fact that they didn't show up seems to be disobedience, disrespect for Moses, disrespect for the command of the Lord. That's the way that I read it. One commentator said it couldn't have been that they were disobedient because then God wanted to give them the Spirit. I think that almost completely misses the point. It's like, okay, listen, I'm calling these guys. I know who they are. I know these guys are slackers. I don't see how you read them not showing anything other than disobedience. But again, we're not told explicitly, but they were called and they didn't come. All right, so you make of that what you will. If you call your kids and they don't come, what do you think? I'll just leave it at that. All right, so two men remained in the camp, one named Eldad and the other named Medad, and the Spirit rested on them, and they were among those registered, but they had not gone out to the tent, and so they prophesied in the camp. And the young man ran and told Moses, and Joshua was there, and he said, hey, Lord, make them stop. But Moses said, Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets. The Lord would put his spirit on them. And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. And I think here, again, it's subtle. But what do you see? You see Moses' sort of humble response to what God has done. All right? God has taken the Spirit, he's spread it on some, even on some of these disobedient people who didn't show up. They've all been prophesying. And the way sin works, it would have been immediately easy for Moses to want to shut these guys down because he wanted help, but these guys didn't obey him when he called, and should I shut them down? And what Moses does instead is says, don't be jealous for me. Don't be jealous for me. And you wonder, is Moses are his eyes starting to open just a little bit here? He said, don't be jealous for me. Would that God would make all people of Israel prophets in the camp. Well, the response of the people is a bit different. We see that starting in verse 31. It says, then a wind from the Lord sprang up and it brought quail from the sea and let them fall beside the camp about a day's journey on the side and a day's journey on the other side. So again, remember, a day's journey is a distance measurement, not a time measurement. So it's about how far you can walk in a day. Most people estimate twice, or in the range of 10 to 15 miles, something like that. So there's a swarm of quail for 20 or 30 miles around the camp is what we're being told. And about 2 cubits above the ground. Again, commentators debate what that means. Are you talking about a pile of quail that's 2 cubits high, or you're talking about quail flying at 30 inches above the ground? Again, there's debate, but we don't have to settle that question. It's a lot of birds, right? That's the idea here. Because what are we told? It says the people rose all that day and all night and all the next day. So they start gathering the quail. I guess they're batting them out of the air with their bats or whatever. You can imagine the scene however you want. I mean, I don't really know how they're gathering the quail, but they are gathering the quail. It's more than a day's work. They work all day. They work again over the next night. They're working the next day. This is a very long shift that they are working, gathering quails. And we're told he who gathered the least gathered 10 homers. All right, and if you look at the footnote of the ESV down at the bottom, it says that a homer is about 220 liters, so 2,000 liters of quail. This is what each person got. This is a lot of food. And this is supposed to be meat for a month of feasting. Right? That's what they're gathering is meat for a month of feasting. And once they've done the work, once they've got the meat, they spread it out to dry. And we're told, verse 33, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. And again, I can remember reading this story as a kid and wondering, what did they do wrong? And they asked for meat, God gave them meat, they were eating the meat, and God struck them down. Like, what in the world? You can kind of understand the question if you just sort of read it at a very superficial level. You're like, okay, what did you do? What did they do wrong? I actually have the same reaction, as a kid to the Balaam story that we'll come across later in the story. It's like, God told Balaam not to go. Balaam told him I'm not supposed to go. And then people asked again. Balaam said, hey, can I go? And God said, go. And then he got mad at him. It's like, what? What's going on here? Again, I think we have to understand, something about the way the human heart works and the way that a father relates to children. We probably all have that experience, where you said, fine, do what you want. And that's not your blessing upon what your kid is about to do. That is an expression of discipline. You have made it abundantly clear to them that going down this path is going to be an act of rebellion. Going down this path is an act of distrust. And going down this path displeases you. And finally, when you say, do what you want, and they rejoice and go off and do their thing, it confirms the rebellion that is in their heart. It doesn't express a newfound willingness to walk in obedience. Right? We've all had that experience with kids, right? We all know that. And I'm convinced that God gives us kids as sort of a microcosm so that we can see our own sinfulness in them, right? Because kids just do blatantly what we do subtly, right? And that's a picture of what's going on here. God said, do what you want. Well, that is an expression of God's judgment and displeasure in what is about to happen. And the people said, oh yeah, he gave us permission to do what we want, let's go. And of course, their eating of the meat then is not just a reception of thanksgiving of God's good and gracious gift. Their eating of the meat is actually the final act of their rebellion against the Lord, the final expression of their distrust. And because of that, it kindles God's wrath. And again, he strikes them with a great plague. We're not told what the plague is, but we're not told exactly how many die at this point. But they buried some portion of the people who had the craving, and they named that place the grave of the craving. The grave of the craving. This is what people had the craving to die. Right? And so again, it's a picture, but I think what we're supposed to see at the end of the chapter here is, again, it's subtle at this point, but the distinction between sort of Moses' response to the rebuke and the people's response to the rebuke. Moses, in his humility, sort of accepts God's judgment and says, do not be jealous of me. Don't worry about me. I kind of brought this on my own head. Where the people just run headlong into feasting. Glad that they've got their craving satisfied. Unconcerned for the disrespect that they have shown to the Lord. And again, in that I think we find our own lesson, because the people are going to continue to go down this path of doing their own thing. And we'll actually, and of course we'll see that in Moses as well. Eventually, Moses himself was not going to enter into the promised land because he fails to honor the Lord as holy. All right. But here I think his response is better. In the sense that he says, do not be jealous for me. I brought this on my own head. And there is at least a glimmer of repentance in that. And we're going to see in the next chapter that was a lesson he seemed to have learned. Because in the next chapter he's going to be called the meekest of men. The meekest man on the face of the earth. His self-pity is rooted in pride. And here, Moses seems to be humbled, where he says, "Do not be jealous for me." But whether the Lord would pour out His Spirit on all people, where the people simply run headlong into satisfying their craving, and that will continue to lead them on the road that will eventually lead them to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So I know we whirlwind through this chapter, but we're a little over our time. But any questions, comments? Anyone want to pick up on anything in particular before we close down tonight?
Both frightening and encouraging.
Yeah. I think these Old Testament stories are that. They are warnings. And God gives us a picture of the Israelites as a warning, but He also does it in a way that points us back towards His mercy. It says, "Hey, listen, these people are running headlong into death. don't follow them. Come to me and find your rest in me. There's always that invitation there in the narrative of entrust yourself to me. That's the phrase again that Peter uses of Jesus, and it's a phrase that really sticks with me. I come back to it a lot. Am I willing to entrust myself to the Father? Am I willing to go without me in the wilderness and trust myself to Him and trust that what He has for me in this moment is what I need in this moment to get towards ultimately taking me, which is the promised land, where I will not lack meat in the promised land. But maybe He needs me to go out now so that I can learn to walk in the footsteps of faith. And that's what God's always doing. That's why the author of Hebrews says, "Do not forget the word of encouragement that is spoken to you as sons." That phrase comes out of Deuteronomy as Moses is reflecting on this history. He says, "Do not forget the word of encouragement that was spoken to you as sons." If God's disciplining you, it's because He loves you, and He's preparing you for life in the age to come, a life for which He originally created you, that life in which you will find ultimately your deepest satisfaction and joy. So, I think a warning, but also an encouragement. Robert, get the last words.
Yeah. So if you take the imagery here, like to its logical conclusion, the whole camp is full of death and essentially rotting flesh, and the people are full of joy for that, and then they start consuming.
Yeah,
It's like no wonder there's a plague going on. If you have birds flying at human height and you can just whack them, they're probably sickly birds too. But the whole camp is full of overwhelming death.
Yeah.
It's not just like a bird for a family. It's immense.
Yeah, and 2,000 liters, I don't know how many birds that is, but that's a lot.
1,002 liters of Coke sitting in front of you.
So, yeah.
Full meat.
Yeah. All right, let me close this in prayer. Father, we do thank you again for your word. We thank you that you have these things written down for our instruction, that we might learn from your people and from your interactions with your people, Father. May we learn from them to walk humbly with you, to entrust ourselves to you, and to rest in your provision, knowing, Father, that one day you will bring us into Canaan, that one day you will give us that inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading in glory. Until that day, Father, may we trust you day by day, in Jesus' name.